Welcome to my family history project. To begin this journey, we'll have to travel back in time to 1922 in a city called Puławy, which is in Poland. This is where my great-grandmother was born. Her name was Malka Fleck, and she was the oldest of 8 children in her family. Her father, Zev, was the head of the Chevra Kadisha, otherwise known as the Burial Committee, and her mother, Dina, was a midwife. Now let's fast forward to the Second World War. Malka's hometown was flattened by the Nazis, and her family was sent to live in the Dęblin-Motycz ghetto. From the ghettos, Malka went to 4 different concentration camps. We know 2 of them. One was called Częstochowa, and the other called Hassag. She worked at a bullet factory during the war in Hassag, making bullets for the German soldiers. Her parents and siblings were sent to Treblinka, where they all perished, including her 2-year-old sister. In the end, she survived the war with her sister Pesa. Now, let's talk about my great-grandfather, Moshe. Moshe was born in 1899 in Bobroniki, Poland, and later moved to Lodz with his family. They ran a food market specializing in fruit. Moshe later married a girl named Rachel Tarangel, and together they had 5 children, but tragically only one, Nehemiah, survived the war. During the Holocaust, Moshe and Nehemiah were taken to the Flossenburg concentration camp. They as well survived Auschwitz by claiming to be skilled locksmiths, a trade that the Nazis needed. After the war, Moshe returned to Lodz. At the same time, Malka and Pesa started to work for her father and son business, which was Moshe and Nehemiah. After a while, Nehemiah grew fond of Pesa, and Nehemiah didn't want to leave his father alone. So to make a very complicated story short, Moshe ended up marrying Malka. But they all realized that remaining in Poland was impossible due to the abundance of post-war anti-Semitism. They decided that they wanted to leave the country. Although Moshe initially wanted to move to Israel with Nehemiah, his son advised against it, citing the harsh conditions and lack of infrastructure, especially for old people. Instead, they discovered long-lost family members in Sydney, Australia, and decided to join them there, seeking to start a new life. Malka and Moshe took an Italian boat to Australia. The boat was called the Luciana Monera. The journey would take 4 to 6 weeks to arrive in Sydney. In the end, the boat arrived on Shabbos, May 21st, 1949 at 11 o'clock with 550 passengers left on board. Malka endured many physical injuries during the Holocaust. She was told that she would never have children, but she had a lot of determination and still wanted to try. After some medical assistance at age 32, she was able to have 2 children, Dina in 1952 and my grandfather, Velvel, in 1954. The Ledermans bought a house on Stewart Street in North Bondi in 1954 for 4,400 British pounds. They sent their kids to a Jewish school called Moriah College, and Moshe became the first chazan of the Bondi Mizrahi Shul. Malka focused on raising her children, but she loved to sew. Now we're going to trace back to how my grandparents met. And to do that, we have to go back in time to my grandmother's side of the family. Bob, my great-grandfather, was born on October 29th, 1926 in Manly, Australia. Fun fact, Bob's Hebrew name is Yosef, and I'm named after him. Bob had 2 sisters, Merle and Vera. Bob's father owned a menswear shop and factory in Darlinghurst, Sydney. He grew up in Vaucluse, Sydney, attended Rose Bay Primary School, and later went to Sydney Boys High School. After finishing school, Bob enrolled in Sydney's University Dentistry program. However, when World War II broke out, he wanted to join the army to contribute to the war effort. Despite being underage, Bob pretended he was old enough to enlist. He joined the military and was sent to Papua New Guinea to fight. After the war, he returned to Sydney and worked in his father's menswear business instead of resuming his dentistry studies. Let's go to my great-grandmother now. Her name was Pearl, and she was born on February 10th, 1932 in Brisbane, Queensland. Pearl had one sister, Frida. Her father died when she was very young, and she had to leave school at 12 years old to get a job to help her family. She worked as a dressmaker and was supposedly very good at it. Her mother was a fur coat seamstress. Their family had to move around a lot, and eventually they thought that moving to Sydney would be a good idea. So they drove 10 hours to Sydney to try and start a new life. To fast forward a bit, both Bob and Pearl spent their high school years in Sydney together. They met at the Great Synagogue Youth Dance and fell in love with each other there. In the end, they got married when Bob was 26 and Pearl was 20. They had 3 children together, the eldest Narelle or Nechama, my grandmother, followed by Margot and Bart. Now it is finally time to connect the dots between the 2 sides of my family. My grandmother and grandfather both lived fairly normal childhoods, and they met in their teenage years. There is a seminar in Australia for high school students which is called Counterpoint, and they both went to this seminar. A lot of teens became madrichim or guides/leaders in this seminar. My grandfather went as a representative of B'nai Akiva, and my grandmother went to represent the Jewish Students' Union. This is how my grandfather told me this story. After the event, we got a lift back home in a friend's car, and I was a gentleman, so I asked her, "Do you want to sit in the front?" And she said yes. Then a few days later, he asked her if she would go out with him, and she said yes. A few years later, in 1978, they got married. 2 years later, in 1980, is when they started to have children. They have 8 kids: Leah, Shlomi, Sroli, my dad, Chanala, Frady, Chaya, Moishi, and Jedge. My father was born on June 5th, 1984. My father grew up in a house on Anglesey Street in Bondi, which is where my grandparents live until this day. My father went to a school called Yeshiva College, which is now called Kesser Torah College, and it's in Dover Heights. After his primary school education, he went to 1 year of high school, which is grade 7 in Australia, and then dropped out to go to a Chabad yeshiva in Toronto. After 3.5 years in Toronto, he decided to further his studies and go to another yeshiva for a year in Crown Heights, New York, which is called Olei Torah. After his years in yeshiva, he went on shlichos, or emissary, in Manchester, UK. Then afterwards, he completed his smicha, or rabbi's course, in Pretoria, South Africa. After all of his endeavors, my father went back to Sydney to work as a paper goods delivery guy. This is how he met my mother. But before we get to that, we have to go to Johannesburg, South Africa, which is where my mother was born. My mother was born on February 16th, 1986. She attended Torah Academy of Johannesburg for primary school. In Johannesburg at that time, there was a lot of muggings and robberies. This is because the time period that South Africa was in was called the post-apartheid. The apartheid was a system of racial segregation that existed in South Africa at the time. In this system, the minority, the white South Africans, held higher status than the blacks. This prevented the blacks from getting good jobs and going certain places. In the post-apartheid times, the blacks were aggravated that all this time they were oppressed, so they revolted by robbing people's homes, mugging people, and other acts of violence. In result of this, in 1999, when my mom was 13 years old, they decided that they wanted to move to Sydney, Australia, because they had family already living there. Let's fast forward in my mom's life till she met my father. They don't have such a complicated story. My grandparents set the 2 of them up to date. They dated for around 3 weeks and then were engaged for 2 months. Something I didn't mention before is that my dad met someone while he was in yeshiva, and his name was Ben Sion Heitner. He went to school with my grandfather in Australia. He owned a company in Toronto called Cambridge Global Payments. He said this to my dad before leaving Toronto: "If you ever come back to Toronto, I have a job waiting for you." My dad eventually accepted this offer. Once my parents got married in 2007, They decided that next year they would temporarily return to Toronto to see if it was a suitable place to raise a family. They did just that in 2008 while they were pregnant with me and returned to Australia to have me. After having me, they remained in Australia for 2 months, then afterwards moved to Toronto for real. Once there, they settled in and had 3 more children after me, Libby, Rafi, and Kobe. So that's my family history up until I immigrated to Canada. By the way, just recently I became a Canadian citizen after being a permanent resident for over 14 years. My parents thought it was about time we became citizens. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed my story. Thank you so much for listening.